Sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones everyone overlooks. When your own family laughs at your inheritance, it cuts deeper than any wound. Elias Stone stood in that lawyer's office, clutching a silver dollar and a deed to worthless land, while his brothers mocked him. They inherited mansions and cattle empires. He got dirt and humiliation. But when he rode out to inspect that patch called Deadman's Flats, what he found changed everything. The valley held a secret his father kept, a secret that would turn $1 into an empire. Could a forgotten son bring his brothers to their knees? Before we jump back in, I want to hear from you. Tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments below. And if this story of family, legacy, and unexpected fortune touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed to this channel because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain across the Stone Ranch, just as it had for 30 years. From the main house, you could see clear to the mountains on a day like this. Mountains that held secrets no one in the valley suspected. But that morning in the spring of 1882, those secrets still lay buried beneath granite and time, waiting for the right moment to surface. Jebediah Stone lay dying in the master bedroom of the ranch house he'd built with his own hands 3 decades prior. The room smelled of camphor and old leather, of medicines that couldn't cure what time itself had come to collect. His breathing came shallow and labored, each breath a negotiation with mortality. At 72, he'd outlived most men who'd come west in the gold rush days, but the cancer eating through his lungs cared nothing for his toughness or his will. His 2 eldest sons stood at the foot of the bed like pallbearers, already measuring the casket. Marcus Stone, 45 and broad-shouldered, had his father's jaw and his mother's cold eyes. He'd run the daily operations of the ranch for 20 years, managing the herds and the hands with efficiency, if not warmth. Samuel, 42 and leaner, had always existed in his older brother's shadow, competent enough but lacking the fire that drove Marcus or the curiosity that had marked their youngest brother. That youngest brother wasn't there, hadn't been there for 10 years. "He should be here," Martha said from the doorway. The housekeeper had served the Stone family since before any of the boys were born, her hair gone white in their service, her back bent from decades of labor. But her voice still carried the authority of someone who'd raised 3 boys and wasn't afraid to speak her mind. Elias should know his father's dying. Elias made his choice, Marcus said without turning. He walked away from this family, from his responsibilities. He was 19 years old, Martha replied, her tone sharp. And you know full well what drove him away. Samuel shifted uncomfortably. The family didn't talk about that night. The night Elias had discovered what their father had done to acquire the water rights for the southern grazing lands. The family that had owned those rights had been desperate, drowning in debt, and Jebediah had offered them a price. When they'd refused, he'd called in their loans through a bank he had influence with. Within a month, they'd lost everything. The father had put a bullet in his head rather than face his family's ruin. Elias had confronted Jebediah in this very room, shouting about honor and conscience and all the idealistic notions young men carry, before the world teaches them differently. Jebediah had been unmoved. "This is how empires are built," he'd said. "If you're too soft for it, then you're no son of mine." Elias had left the next morning. No one had seen him since, though word filtered back over the years. He'd worked railroad camps in Colorado, learned surveying in Utah, lived quietly, simply, asking nothing from the family or the fortune bearing his name. Now Jebediah's eyes opened, milky with age and illness, but still sharp beneath the fog. "The lawyer," he rasped. "Bring Tobias." Marcus leaned closer. "Father, the will is already prepared. We've been over this." "Now." The word came with enough force to trigger a coughing fit that brought up blood. Martha hurried forward with a cloth, wiping his mouth with the tenderness only she still offered him. Tobias Weaver arrived within the hour, a thin man in a dusty suit carrying a leather satchel that had seen better days. He'd been the Stone family's lawyer for 15 years, privy to secrets that would have shocked the good people of the valley. He shooed everyone from the room except Martha, who refused to leave, and spent 20 minutes alone with Jebediah while the old man whispered instructions that required 3 separate times to be written down correctly. When Tobias emerged, his face was carefully neutral, but his hands trembled slightly as he secured the papers in his satchel. "It's done," was all he'd say. Jebediah Stone died that night, just after midnight. Martha was with him, holding his hand. His last words were barely audible, but she swore later that he'd said, "Tell the boy I'm sorry." She never clarified which boy he meant. The funeral was held 3 days later at the small church in Cedar Falls, the nearest town to the Stone Ranch. Half the territory attended. Jebediah Stone had been many things: ruthless, calculating, cold, but he'd also been a force that shaped the region. His cattle had fed thousands. His wealth had built businesses. His influence had brought the railroad surveyors to their corner of Wyoming, though what came of that was still being written. Marcus and Samuel stood at the graveside in black suits that made them look like undertakers of their own father's legacy. They accepted condolences with appropriate gravity, already calculating what the ranch's books would look like under their sole control. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following day at Tobias Weaver's office in town. What they didn't know, what nobody except Tobias and the telegraph operator knew, was that a wire had been sent to a mining camp in Colorado 3 days earlier. The message was simple: "Your father is dying. Come home." Elias Stone rode into Cedar Falls on the morning of the will reading. 10 years had changed him from a lanky 19-year-old into a man of 29, weathered by sun and hardened by labor. His hands bore the calluses of someone who'd worked for his wages. His face carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd survived on his own terms. He wore simple clothes, a work shirt, worn trousers, boots that had seen 1,000 miles. The only concession to the occasion was a clean shave and a hat without holes. He tied his horse outside Tobias Weaver's office at exactly 10 in the morning. The street was busier than usual, townspeople finding excuses to linger near the lawyer's office. Everyone wanted to know how Jebediah Stone would divide his empire. When Elias pushed through the door, the conversation in the waiting room died. Marcus and Samuel sat in chairs along the wall, dressed in fine suits that probably cost more than Elias had earned in the past year. Their faces registered shock, then something harder to read. Marcus recovered first, standing slowly. "You came," Marcus said, his tone neutral. "I did," Elias replied. He took off his hat, held it in both hands. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Our loss," Samuel corrected, but there was no warmth in it. "He was your father too." "Was he?" The question hung in the air like gun smoke. Before anyone could respond, Tobias Weaver appeared in the doorway to his inner office. "Gentlemen, please come in. We have much to discuss." The office was cramped and smelled of old paper and tobacco. A large desk dominated the space, covered with documents that represented the sum of a man's life, reduced to property lines and asset columns. Tobias took his seat behind the desk. The 3 brothers arranged themselves in chairs facing him. Marcus in the middle, Samuel to his right, Elias to his left. Even in death, their father's influence kept them apart. Tobias opened a leather folder and withdrew several documents. He adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. The last will and testament of Jebediah Stone, written and witnessed according to the laws of the Wyoming Territory. He looked up at the 3 men. "Before I begin, I want to note that your father was of sound mind when these arrangements were made. I can attest to that personally." "Just read it," Marcus said. Tobias began. The language was formal and tedious, full of legal phrases that meant nothing to anyone but lawyers. But the substance was clear enough. To Marcus Stone, the eldest, went the main ranch house, the breeding stock, and the northern grazing lands, approximately 40,000 acres of prime cattle country. To Samuel Stone, the middle son, went the southern grazing lands and the water rights associated with them, plus the ranch's operational accounts and equipment. It was a fortune by any measure. The two brothers would be among the wealthiest men in Wyoming. They could hear the numbers and calculations adding up in their heads. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Samuel exhaled relief. Then Tobias cleared his throat again and picked up a different document. To my youngest son, Elias Stone. The brothers leaned forward slightly, curious what token their father had left the prodigal. Perhaps a small sum? Maybe a horse? Nothing that would matter. Tobias continued, I leave the sum of $1 silver and the property known as Deadman's Flats, as detailed in the attached deed, including all rights, privileges, and access thereto. Silence filled the office like water filling a well. Then Marcus began to laugh. It started as a chuckle and built into something louder, almost hysterical. Samuel joined in, though his laughter sounded more nervous than amused. $1, Marcus managed between laughs. Father finally told you what you're worth? Deadman's Flats, Samuel added, grinning. That worthless patch of rocks up in the mountains. Can't even graze goats on it. Maybe you can use the $1 to buy yourself a shovel, Marcus said, wiping his eyes. Dig your own grave out there and save everyone the trouble. Elias sat perfectly still, his face revealing nothing. He'd learned in the past 10 years that showing emotion was a luxury working men couldn't afford, but inside, something burned. Not just anger, though there was plenty of that. Something else. Something that felt like the final confirmation that he'd been right to leave, right to build a life separate from the Stone name. Tobias produced the silver $1 from a small envelope, placing it on the desk. It was worn smooth from decades of circulation, nothing special about it. Next came the deed. Old paper, yellowed at the edges, and creased from being folded and unfolded many times. He pushed both across the desk toward Elias. The deed is legitimate and legally binding, Tobias said quietly. Recorded with the Territorial Land Office 15 years ago. 15 years. Elias picked up the deed, studying it. His father had acquired this property when Elias was only 14 years old, long before their falling out. Had it always been intended for him, or was this truly just a final insult from a man who'd never learned to show love without cruelty? Marcus stood, still chuckling. Well, little brother, enjoy your fortune. Samuel and I have a ranch to run. He clapped Samuel on the shoulder and they moved toward the door. But Elias was reading the deed more carefully now, his surveying experience making the legal descriptions clearer than they might have been otherwise. He noticed things. The property boundaries were extensive, not just a patch, as Samuel had said, but several square miles encompassing an entire valley and the ridges around it. There were notations about water rights, marked in perpetuity, and a phrase that caught his attention, sole access corridor through the Granite Pass Range. Wait, Elias said, his voice cutting through his brother's amusement. This deed is old, very old. Why did father buy this land 15 years ago? Tobias's face remained carefully neutral. I couldn't say. Your father made many property investments over the years. But Martha's voice echoed in Elias's memory from all those years ago. Words she'd spoken to him the night he left. Your father always played the long game. The brothers paused at the door. Marcus looked back with contempt. Does it matter? It's worthless land. Father's final joke. They left, their laughter trailing behind them like smoke. Other townspeople who'd been waiting outside followed them, offering congratulations on their inheritance, already angling for favor with the new masters of the Stone Empire. Elias remained seated, turning the silver $1 over in his palm. On one side, Lady Liberty. On the other, an eagle. Two faces of the same coin. He looked at Tobias, who was carefully organizing papers, not meeting his eyes. "Mr. Weaver," Elias said slowly, "you said my father was of sound mind when he made these arrangements." "I did." He was. So this wasn't cruelty. It was something else. Tobias finally looked up, and for just a moment, something flickered in his expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. "Your father once told me that you were the only one of his sons who'd ever questioned him, the only one who'd walk away from money on principle." He paused. "He also said you were the only one smart enough to understand what he was really leaving you." Before Elias could press further, Martha appeared in the doorway. She'd been waiting outside, unwilling to intrude on official business. Now she crossed to Elias and did something surprising. She embraced him, this woman who'd raised him, who'd defended him, who'd never stopped believing he'd come back. "I'm glad you came," she whispered. "What did he mean, Martha? What am I supposed to understand?" She pulled back, her eyes bright with tears and something else, knowledge she wouldn't share. "Your father always played the long game, Elias. Always." She pressed something into his hand, a brass compass, small and worn. "Your mother wanted you to have this. She made me promise, before she passed, that if you ever came back, I'd give it to you." The compass had belonged to his mother, carried west from Pennsylvania when she'd come as a young bride. She died when Elias was 16, and he'd always believed it had been buried with her. The metal was warm in his palm, as if it still held some echo of her warmth. "Thank you," he managed. Martha smiled sadly. "Don't thank me yet. You've got a long ride ahead of you." She glanced at Tobias, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "2 days north by east. Follow the compass. Your mother always said it pointed toward true north. Maybe it'll point you toward the truth your father left behind." Elias left the lawyer's office carrying nothing but a silver dollar, a deed, and his mother's compass. His brothers had inherited an empire. He'd inherited a mystery. On the street, old Ben Cartwright waited by the hitching post, leaning against the rail with the patience of a man who'd outlived hurry. Ben had been a surveyor for the territorial government for 40 years before retiring to Cedar Falls. He'd taught Elias everything he knew about reading land, about understanding what maps and deeds really meant. "Heard about the will," Ben said, not looking at Elias directly. "Heard your brothers laughing about it. They think it's funny." Ben pulled out a pipe, began packing it with tobacco. 15 years ago, I did some survey work for your father. Private work, off the books." He lit the pipe, puffed thoughtfully. "He had me map something up in the mountains. Paid me well to keep it quiet." "What did you map?" "Can't say exactly. But I can tell you this. When the railroad surveyors came through here 2 years ago, they spent a long time looking at those same mountains. Lots of interest in passes and water sources." He finally looked at Elias. "Your father wasn't a kind man, but he wasn't stupid either, and he always knew what was coming before anyone else did. Are you saying this land is actually worth something?" Ben smiled around his pipe stem. "I'm saying you should go look at it before you decide what it's worth. Sometimes the best treasures are the ones nobody else sees." He straightened, preparing to leave. "And Elias, your brothers aren't going to think it's funny for long. When they figure out what your father really did, they're going to be mad, real mad. Watch yourself." Elias returned to his horse and began loading his saddlebags with supplies from the general store. As he worked, he could feel the eyes of the town on him, pity mostly with some amusement. The son who'd inherited nothing, the joke of Cedar Falls. Let them think that. For now. He swung into the saddle just as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains. Those mountains that held secrets. Those mountains where Deadman's flats waited. His mother's compass rested in his shirt pocket, warm against his heart. The silver dollar was in his vest pocket. The deed was folded carefully in his saddlebag, and for the first time since reading that telegram 3 days ago, Elias Stone allowed himself to feel something other than grief. He felt curious, and somewhere in those mountains, answers waited. The humiliation didn't end at the lawyer's office. It followed Elias through the streets of Cedar Falls like a shadow at noon, inescapable and dark. By the time he reached the general store, word had spread through town faster than a prairie fire. The clerk, who'd known him since boyhood, could barely contain his smirk as he tallied up supplies. "Heard about the inheritance, Elias. Real sorry about your luck." "I'll need provisions for 3 days," Elias said, keeping his voice level. "Hardtack, dried beef, coffee, matches. Going to see your fortune." The clerk's attempt at sympathy was undermined by the laughter in his eyes. "Deadman's Flats. They say nothing grows there but rocks and regret." Elias paid with money he'd earned in the railroad camps. Honest wages for honest work. He didn't touch the silver dollar in his pocket. That coin meant something, though he didn't yet understand what. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Not a mob exactly, but enough people to make it clear that his business was now everyone's entertainment. He recognized faces from his childhood, men his father had done business with, women who'd brought pies to his mother's funeral, young people he'd grown up alongside. None of them looked at him with the respect they'd shown his brothers. "There he is," someone muttered. "The Dollar Prince." Laughter rippled through the gathering. Not cruel, but not kind either. The kind of laughter that comes when people see someone brought low and feel secretly grateful. It isn't them. Elias loaded his supplies onto his horse, methodical and calm. He'd learned something important in his years away from the Stone name. Dignity wasn't something others could give or take away. It was something you carried inside yourself, polished by hard choices and harder circumstances. But then his brothers emerged from the hotel across the street, and the tenor of the crowd shifted. Marcus and Samuel commanded attention the way wealthy men always did, as if the air around them was theirs to breathe first. They'd been drinking, celebrating their inheritance with whiskey bought by money that wasn't quite theirs yet. Marcus spotted Elias and grinned, the alcohol making him bolder than usual. "Little brother, leaving us so soon? Don't you want to celebrate the family fortune?" Samuel, always following Marcus's lead, added, "Maybe we should give him another $1, so he can buy that shovel." The crowd laughed louder now, encouraged by the brothers' performance. This was entertainment, watching the Stone family dynamics play out in public, watching the youngest brother put in his place. Elias turned to face them, his hands resting loosely at his sides. 10 years ago, he might have swung at Marcus, might have let rage dictate his response. But he'd learned patience in those years, learned that sometimes the best response was no response at all. "I'm going to see my inheritance," he said simply. "Your inheritance," Marcus repeated, walking closer. The crowd parted for him like water around a stone. $1 and a patch of worthless dirt. You know what that means, don't you? It means Father finally told everyone what we've always known. You're worth nothing. The words were designed to wound, and they did. But Elias had been carrying wounds from his father for 10 years. This one was just another scar forming over old tissue. "Maybe," Elias said quietly. "Or maybe Father left me exactly what he wanted me to have." Marcus's smile faltered for just a moment. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out." "You do that," Marcus said, recovering his swagger. "And when you're done playing with your rocks and dirt, you can come back and beg for a job on our ranch. We might find something for you. Mucking stables, maybe." Samuel laughed on cue. The crowd joined in, though some of the laughter sounded uncertain now. There was something in Elias's bearing, a quiet confidence, a refusal to be diminished that didn't match the script everyone expected. Martha appeared at the edge of the crowd, having followed from the lawyer's office. She carried a bundle wrapped in cloth, which she pressed into Elias's hands. "Food for the journey," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Then, softer, for his ears alone, "Don't let them make you small. You're more than they'll ever understand." Elias squeezed her hand in thanks, secured the bundle to his saddle, and swung himself up onto his horse. From that vantage point, he looked down at his brothers, at the crowd, at the town that had watched him grow from boy to man to stranger. "I'll be back," he said. Not a threat, just a statement of fact. Then he turned his horse north by east, following the direction Martha had indicated, and rode out of Cedar Falls without looking back. Behind him, the laughter eventually faded. The crowd dispersed. His brothers returned to their drinking, and the town moved on to other gossip, other entertainment. But old Ben Cartwright watched from his porch until Elias disappeared into the distance, and he thought about surveys done in secret and mountains that held more than rocks. The ride took Elias away from the familiar grazing lands of the Stone Ranch and into territory that grew progressively wilder. The first day passed in a haze of thought and memory. He couldn't stop turning the silver dollar over in his fingers, couldn't stop wondering what his father had meant. That night, he made camp beside a creek that ran cold and clear from the mountains. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up toward stars that seemed close enough to touch. He pulled out the deed and read it by firelight, studying every word with the careful attention he'd learned from old Ben. The property description was precise and extensive. Deadman's Flats encompassed not just a valley, but the surrounding ridges and peaks. More importantly, it included specific notations about water rights. Not just surface water, but springs and underground sources. And that phrase again, sole access corridor through the Granite Pass Range. Why would anyone care about access through the mountains? The region was remote, largely undeveloped. There was nothing beyond those peaks but more wilderness, more empty land. Unless that was about to change. Elias thought about what old Ben had said. Railroad surveyors spending time in the mountains 2 years ago. The Transcontinental Railroad had been completed more than a decade earlier, but expansion was ongoing. New routes, new towns, new fortunes built along steel rails that connected east to west. He pulled out his mother's compass, watched the needle swing to true north. The brass was cool now in the mountain air, but he could still feel the weight of memory in it. His mother had believed in him when his father couldn't or wouldn't. She'd seen something in him worth nurturing, curiosity, independence, a moral compass that pointed toward principles rather than profit. "What did you see, Mother?" he whispered to the night. "What did Father see that made him leave me this?" The stars offered no answers, but the mountains loomed ahead, dark and massive against the sky. Somewhere up there, Deadman's Flats waited. Somewhere up there, the truth of his inheritance lay hidden. He slept fitfully that night, dreams mixing with memories, his mother reading to him as a child, his father's stern face across the dinner table, Marcus's contemptuous laughter, Samuel's casual cruelty, and through it all, a question that wouldn't release him. What game had his father been playing? The second day brought him deeper into the mountains. The terrain grew rougher, the trail less defined. He passed through stands of pine and aspen, crossed streams that tumbled down from heights he couldn't yet see. The air grew thinner, sharper, carrying scents of stone and snow even in spring. Around midday, he encountered a freight wagon heading in the opposite direction, back toward the lowlands. The driver was a thick-shouldered man with a face weathered by sun and wind, wearing clothes that showed hard use. The wagon bed was covered with canvas, concealing its cargo. "You're lost," the driver called out, pulling his team to a halt. "No," Elias replied. "Heading to Deadman's Flats." The driver's expression shifted. Surprise, then something harder to read. Wariness, perhaps. "That's so. What business you got up there?" My business, Elias said, not impolitely but firmly. The driver studied him for a long moment, then spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Suit yourself. Just know that things are different up there now. Lot of changes coming, lot of money being spent. Changes like what? But the driver was already slapping the reins, urging his horses forward. You'll see soon enough. Just watch yourself. Big operations don't like complications. The wagon rolled past, and Elias noticed details. The horses were well fed and strong, the wagon built for heavy loads, the canvas covering equipment that looked expensive. This wasn't some prospector or homesteader. This was commercial operation, organized and funded. His curiosity intensified. He pressed on, following the trail that led steadily upward. By late afternoon, he began to hear sounds that didn't belong in wilderness. The distant ring of metal on metal, the sharp blast of a steam whistle, voices calling out in coordinated work rhythms. The trail climbed steeply now, following a granite ridge that thrust up from the mountainside like a natural fortress. Elias dismounted and led his horse carefully up the rocky path, his heart beginning to pound. Not from exertion, but from anticipation. At the top of the ridge he stopped, stood absolutely still, and stared down into a valley that shouldn't exist. Below him, spread across the floor of Deadman's flats, was a town. Not a mining camp or a rough settlement, but an actual town. Dozens of buildings in various stages of completion. Streets laid out in orderly grids. Water towers rising above wooden frames. Rail yards where steel tracks gleamed in the afternoon sun. Hundreds of workers moved through the construction site like ants in a disturbed hill, purposeful and organized. Steam engines hauled materials, carpenters framed buildings, stonemasons laid foundations. A massive depot was taking shape at the center of it all, its roof already installed, its walls bearing fresh paint. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, were signs marking the operation. Union Pacific Railroad and Stonegate Station. Elias's hands trembled as he pulled the deed from his pocket again, checking the boundaries. Yes, this entire valley, this entire town, this entire operation was happening on land that belonged to him. His father's land. No, his land now. The silver dollar in his pocket suddenly felt heavier than any dollar had a right to feel. This wasn't punishment. This wasn't cruelty. This was something far more complex, far more calculated. This was power. The sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the new town in shades of gold and amber. Elias stood on that ridge, the wind tugging at his hair, and tried to comprehend what he was seeing. Tried to understand what his father had known, what he'd planned, what he'd quietly set in motion years before his death. Tomorrow, he'd ride down into that valley. He'd present his deed to whoever was in charge. He'd begin to understand the inheritance his brothers had laughed at. But tonight, standing on that ridge with the weight of revelation pressing down on him, Elias Stone allowed himself one luxury he hadn't permitted in years. He smiled. Elias made camp on the ridge that night, unable to tear himself away from the view. Every few minutes he'd walk back to the edge and look down at the town taking shape in the valley below. Lamplight began to appear as darkness fell. Dozens of lights marking buildings and work areas, creating a constellation on the valley floor that matched the stars overhead. He could hear it too, even from this distance, the sounds of civilization carving itself into wilderness, hammers and saws, men calling to each other, a piano playing somewhere, probably in one of the newly completed saloons, the lonely whistle of a steam engine. This wasn't some small operation. This was ambition made manifest in timber and steel. Sleep came hard that night. When it finally arrived, his dreams were full of his father's face, that stern, unreadable expression that had defined Elias's childhood. In the dream, Jebediah spoke. "I gave you what you needed, not what you wanted." The words echoed and overlapped until they became meaningless sound. He woke before dawn, the mountain air cold enough to frost his bedroll. His breath came out in clouds as he prepared coffee over a rekindled fire. The brass compass sat beside him on a rock, its needle pointing steadily north, toward truth, his mother had always said. Toward purpose. As light crept across the valley below, he could see the town more clearly. What he'd thought was chaos the previous afternoon revealed itself as organized precision. The streets formed a grid pattern centered on the large depot building. Residential blocks were clearly separated from commercial areas. There were spaces set aside for churches and schools. Whoever planned this meant for it to be permanent. The largest building, aside from the depot, bore a sign he could just barely read. Union Pacific, Western District Construction Office. That's where he needed to go. Elias saddled his horse, checked his provisions, and carefully folded the deed before placing it inside his shirt. The silver dollar went into his vest pocket, pressed over his heart. Then he began the descent into the valley, following a switchback trail that showed recent use. Wagons had carved deep ruts into the earth. As he approached the outskirts of the town, workers began to notice him. They paused in their labor, watching the lone rider with curiosity. Elias was conscious of how he must look. Dusty from travel, wearing simple clothes, riding a working horse rather than a gentleman's mount. Just another drifter, probably looking for a job. A foreman stepped into the street, holding up a hand. He was a big man, barrel-chested, with a face that had seen every kind of weather. "You lost, friend." Elias reined in his horse. Not lost, looking for whoever's in charge of this operation. The foreman's eyes narrowed. "We're not hiring right now. Full crew." "I'm not looking for work." "Then what do you want?" "To speak with whoever runs this office." Elias gestured toward the Union Pacific building. The foreman studied him more carefully, taking in details, the steady way Elias sat his horse, the confidence in his voice despite his appearance, something in his bearing that suggested he wasn't just another saddle tramp. "That'd be Mr. Holloway. But he's a busy man. Can't just walk in off the street." "I think he'll want to see me." "Yeah? Why's that?" Elias met his eyes directly. "Because I own the land he's building on." The foreman's expression shifted, from dismissive to uncertain. "That's not funny, friend. It's not meant to be." Elias patted his shirt where the deed rested. "I have papers that say this valley belongs to me. Every building, every street, every rail yard. It's all on my property." The foreman's face went through several emotions in quick succession. Disbelief, concern, then a harder look that suggested he was recalculating everything. "Wait here." He turned and strode toward the construction office, moving faster than his bulk suggested possible. Elias dismounted and tied his horse to a hitching post someone had thoughtfully installed. Around him, work had slowed as word spread. Men were whispering to each other, glancing his way. A few looked amused, as if he'd told a good joke. Others looked worried, recognizing that jokes didn't usually involve lawyers and land deeds. The foreman returned with another man, tall, lean, wearing a suit despite the construction site dust. This man carried himself with authority, and his eyes held the sharp assessment of someone who dealt with problems for a living. "I'm James Holloway," the man said without preamble. "Union Pacific's chief construction supervisor for the Western District. I understand you have some kind of claim." "Not some kind of claim." Elias pulled out the deed, unfolded it carefully, and held it out. "The claim. This valley, all of it, belongs to me." Holloway took the deed, his expression skeptical, but as he read, that skepticism transformed into something closer to alarm. His lips moved slightly as he worked through the legal descriptions, comparing them mentally to the town layout around them. When he looked up, his face was pale beneath its tan. "This is dated 15 years ago." "Yes." "Recorded with the Territorial Land Office." "Yes, And your name is? Holloway looked at the bottom of the deed. Elias Stone. That's right. Jesus Christ. Holloway looked around at his town, at the months of work and the millions of dollars invested. Who the hell are you? Until recently, I was nobody. A surveyor, a railroad worker, someone who moved from camp to camp. Elias took the deed back, folded it carefully. But my father died 2 weeks ago. He left me this property. I inherited it yesterday. Your father. Holloway's mind was clearly working through possibilities. Would that be Jebediah Stone, the cattle baron? Yes. We tried to buy this land from him years ago. He refused to sell, wouldn't even meet with our representatives. Holloway's voice took on an edge. We assumed he'd passed away or lost interest. The land looked abandoned. No development, no claims posted, nothing. So we began construction 6 months ago, without confirming ownership. Holloway's jaw tightened. We confirmed that Jebediah Stone owned it. We assumed... He stopped, realizing how that sounded. We thought we could negotiate after we'd already invested. Make him an offer he couldn't refuse. You thought you could bully him? That's not what I said, but it's what you meant. Elias looked around at the town, at the workers who'd stopped pretending to work and were now openly watching this confrontation. How much have you spent here? That's not your concern. Actually, it is. You're building on my land without permission. Every nail, every board, every brick, it's trespassing. So I'll ask again, how much have you spent? Holloway was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he said, north of $2 million. And we're not finished. $2 million. The number hung in the air like smoke. Elias had lived on wages that sometimes didn't reach $20 a month. His brothers had inherited a ranch worth perhaps $100,000. And this man had spent $2 million on land he didn't own, assuming he could force a sale after the fact. I need to send a telegram to headquarters, Holloway said, his voice carefully controlled. This is beyond my authority, but I'll tell you right now, Union Pacific doesn't take kindly to extortion. I'm not extorting anyone, Elias replied calmly. I'm simply establishing that I own this land. What happens next depends on you. Is that a threat? It's a fact. You've built an entire town on property that belongs to me. You did so without permission, without agreement, without even basic courtesy. Now you're angry because you can't just take what you want. Elias untied his horse, prepared to mount. Send your telegram. Contact whoever you need to contact. I'll be back in 3 days. That should give your people time to review the situation and prepare a proper offer. Wait, Holloway said. And there was something new in his voice, not quite desperation, but close. Where are you going? To read my deed more carefully, to understand exactly what my father left me. Elias swung into the saddle, looking down at Holloway from that height, and to decide what it's worth. He rode out of the valley at a steady pace, feeling hundreds of eyes on his back. Behind him, Holloway stood in the street, still holding an imaginary copy of that deed in his mind, calculating and recalculating what this meant for the railroad's plans. The foreman approached him carefully. Boss, what do we do? Holloway watched the lone rider disappear up the switchback trail. We keep building, and we pray to God that kid can be bought. And if he can't? Holloway didn't answer. He was already walking toward the telegraph office, composing in his head a message that would travel across wires to Omaha, where men far more powerful than him would read it and realize that a 29-year-old cowboy now held their entire western expansion project in his hands. Up on the ridge, Elias stopped once more to look back. The town spread below like a game board, pieces arranged by players who'd thought they knew all the rules. But the rules had just changed. His father had given him more than land. He'd given him leverage, He'd given him power, and most importantly, he'd given him a choice. What kind of man would Elias be with that power? The compass in his pocket seemed to grow heavier, as if weighing his conscience along with his direction. True north, his mother had said. But what was true north in a situation like this? He didn't know yet, but he had 3 days to figure it out. Elias rode to Cedar Falls that same afternoon, arriving as the sun hung low in the western sky. The town was quiet in that pause between day and evening, when decent folk finished their work and less decent folk prepared for theirs. He went straight to Tobias Weaver's office, where lamplight already glowed in the windows. The lawyer looked up from his desk as Elias entered, unsurprised by the visit. "I wondered when you'd return." "The deed is real," Elias said without preamble. "There's an entire town being built on that land. A railroad town. Union Pacific has invested millions." Tobias nodded slowly, setting down his pen. "Sit down, Elias. There are things you need to know." Elias took the offered chair, suddenly exhausted from the day's revelations. "Did you know what was up there?" "I knew your father had refused several offers from the railroad over the years. Substantial offers. Each time he turned them down without explanation." Tobias pulled a folder from a drawer, opened it to reveal correspondence. "The last offer came 8 months ago, $600,000 for the property and access rights. He rejected it within a day." 600,000. The number made Elias's head spin. "Why?" "Because he knew what I'm about to tell you and what you need to understand." Tobias spread several documents across his desk. Surveys, water rights records, railroad route maps. "Your father bought that land 15 years ago, not because of what it was, but because of what it would become. He recognized something the railroad didn't realize at the time. The pass through the mountains. More than that. Look here." Tobias pointed to a survey map. "This entire mountain range runs north-south for more than 200 miles. There are exactly 3 passes through it wide enough and low enough for railroad construction. The southern pass is controlled by the territorial government. They'd never sell to private interests. The northern pass requires bridging a canyon that would cost more than building 100 miles of track elsewhere. And the middle pass is on your property, not just through it, but entirely on it. The only feasible route for the railroad's western expansion runs directly through land that your father acquired for less than $5,000. Tobias smiled thinly. "He was a ruthless man, your father, but he understood leverage better than anyone I've ever known." Elias studied the maps, his surveying experience making the terrain clear. The railroad had no choice. They'd already built Stonegate Station. They'd invested in infrastructure, in planning, in promises made to merchants and settlers. To abandon it now would be financial catastrophe. "There's more," Tobias said quietly. He pulled out another document, this one marking water sources. "Your deed includes perpetual water rights to Crystal Creek and its tributaries. Those waters feed the entire valley. Without them, the town can't function, but that's not all they feed." He traced a finger along the creek's path on the map. It flowed down from the mountains, through Deadman's Flats, and then south, directly through the heart of Stone Ranch grazing land. Elias felt his breath catch. "Father controlled the ranch's water supply. For 20 years, your brothers never knew. They assumed the water rights were part of the ranch property, but your father separated them decades ago." Tobias looked at Elias with something approaching respect. "He spent his life building an empire for your brothers to inherit, and then he made sure they could never hold it without you." The implications crashed over Elias like a wave. His father hadn't just left him leverage over the railroad. He'd left him leverage over his own family. Without access to Crystal Creek, the Stone Ranch would wither and die within a season. The cattle would have to be moved or sold at devastating losses. The family fortune would evaporate. "Why?" Elias asked, his voice rough. "Why would he do this?" Tobias was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. I think he wanted to see what kind of man you'd become, whether you'd use this power for revenge or for something else. He paused. There's a letter. Your father left it with me, with instructions to give it to you only after you'd visited the property and returned. He produced a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, bearing Elias's name in his father's distinctive hand. The wax seal was intact, marked with the Stone family crest, a mountain with a star above it. Elias took the letter with trembling hands. How long have you had this? 15 years. He wrote it the same day he acquired the Deadman's Flats property, sealed it in my presence, and told me exactly when to deliver it. Tobias stood, moved toward the door. Read it in private. Take your time. I'll be in the next room if you need anything. Alone in the office, Elias stared at the envelope for a long time before breaking the seal. His father's handwriting was stronger here, unmarked by the tremors of illness. The letter was written by a younger man, one still in the prime of his power. Elias, it began, if you're reading this, I'm dead, and you've discovered what I left you. By now you've seen the town. You understand the leverage. You probably hate me for the way I've manipulated you, your brothers, everyone involved in this elaborate scheme. You have every right to that hatred. I was a poor father. I pushed you away, favored your brothers, made you feel worthless. I did this deliberately, though I doubt you'll believe me. Marcus and Samuel are good men in their way, but they lack something essential. They lack the ability to question, to think beyond the immediate, to see beyond profit to principle. They would have taken this land and sold it to the railroad for whatever they could get. They would have been rich, yes, but they would have been controlled, owned by men in Omaha who cared nothing for this territory or its people. You left home over a matter of principle. You walked away from wealth because you believed I'd acted without honor. You were right. That family I destroyed for their water rights. It haunts me still. But it taught me something about you. It showed me that of my 3 sons, only one had a conscience that couldn't be bought. I'm giving you something your brothers will never have. The power to shape the future. Not just of our family, but of this entire region. The railroad will make Stonegate Station a major hub. Thousands of people will build their lives there. What kind of town it becomes, what rules govern it, what values it holds, that's in your hands now. Your brothers will need you. They don't know it yet, but they will. Their fortune depends on water you control. I've engineered a situation where the 3 of you must work together, or all fail separately. Perhaps that's cruel, but families should need each other, don't you think? I know I failed you in many ways. I was better at building empires than loving sons. But I built this particular empire for you, Elias. Not because you were the youngest or the weakest, but because you were the strongest where it mattered most. In character, in integrity, in the ability to see beyond yourself. Use this power wisely. Be the man I couldn't be. Build something that matters, not just something that profits. Your mother would have been proud of you. I hope in time you'll understand that in my own broken way, I'm proud of you too. Your father, Elias Stone. Elias read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face by the second reading. All these years he'd believed his father despised him. All these years he'd carried the wound of rejection like a scar across his soul. And now, sitting in a lawyer's office with a dead man's words in his hands, he understood. His father had loved him, had believed in him, had spent 15 years preparing a gift disguised as an insult, a test wrapped in humiliation. The cruelty had been the point. It had been preparation. When Tobias returned, he found Elias sitting in the gathering darkness, the letter resting on his lap, his face wet with tears he didn't bother to hide. He knew, Elias said quietly. He knew exactly what he was doing. Yes, Tobias replied. He always did. What do I do now? The lawyer came and sat across from him, his expression gentle. That's the question he wanted you to answer for yourself. He's given you the tools. How you use them defines not his legacy, but yours. Elias looked at the map still spread across the desk, at the deed that had transformed from punishment to power, at the letter that reframed his entire understanding of his past. 3 days until the railroad expected his answer. 3 days to decide what kind of man he was. Not what kind of son. Not what kind of brother. What kind of man? "I need to think," he said finally. "Where will you go?" Elias stood, folding the letter carefully and placing it inside his shirt beside the deed. "Up to the ridge, where I can see both what is and what could be." He left the office as full darkness settled over Cedar Falls, retrieved his horse, and rode north toward the mountains once more. Behind him, lamplight-filled windows and smoke rose from chimneys, and life continued in its comfortable rhythms. Ahead, in those mountains, a town was being built by men who didn't know they'd been building on a foundation of one man's long game, a game that had taken 15 years to play and would be won or lost in 3 days. The brass compass pointed north, toward truth, toward the hard decisions that would define everything that followed. Elias rode toward that truth, carrying the weight of his father's faith in who he could become. The next morning found Elias on the ridge again, watching Stone Gate Station wake with the dawn. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys. Workers emerged from bunkhouses and boarding rooms. The sound of hammers and saws began their daily rhythm. It was, he realized, a kind of miracle, civilization carved from wilderness in the span of months. He spent the day there, observing, watching how the town functioned, seeing families arrive on wagons, merchants opening shops, children playing in the streets while their parents built their futures. These weren't railroad executives or wealthy speculators. These were ordinary people staking everything on the promise of a new town in a new territory. They'd done so because Union Pacific had promised them opportunity, jobs, land, a future. And now that future rested in Elias's hands. Around midday, a rider approached from the valley. A young man on a good horse, wearing clothes that marked him as someone's assistant or secretary. He spotted Elias on the ridge and climbed up cautiously. "Mr. Stone," the young man called. "Mr. Holloway sent me. He'd like to speak with you. No pressure, just he'd like to talk." Elias studied the messenger. "Tell him I'll come down tomorrow. I'm not ready today." The young man nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "Sir, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Are you going to shut us down?" "The town, I mean. My family just arrived last week. My father sold everything we had back in Ohio to open a shop here. If the town closes—" He stopped, collecting himself. "I guess I'm asking if you're going to destroy all this." The question cut to the heart of things. Elias looked at the young man's earnest face, saw his own younger self reflected there. Someone trying to build a life on hope and hard work. "I haven't decided what I'm going to do," Elias said honestly. "But I'm not interested in destroying what people have built. I just need to understand what's fair." The messenger seemed reassured by that, enough to relax slightly. "Mr. Holloway isn't a bad man, sir. He's under a lot of pressure from the company, but he cares about the town, about the people. I'll keep that in mind." After the messenger left, Elias returned to his observation. He watched Holloway emerge from the construction office several times throughout the afternoon, checking progress, speaking with foremen, solving problems. The man moved with the authority of someone who'd built things before, who understood how to turn plans into reality. As evening approached, Elias rode down into the valley by a different route, circling to approach the town from the east. He wanted to see it from every angle, understand its relationship to the land. What he found confirmed what the deed had told him. The entire operation depended on water from Crystal Creek. The railroad had built elaborate systems to channel that water throughout the site. Without it, the town would die of thirst within days. He camped that night just outside the town's boundary, close enough to hear the sounds of evening, Music from a saloon, laughter from the boarding houses, a baby crying, someone singing. Life happening in real time, fragile and precious. Sleep came easier this time, though his dreams were troubled by decisions not yet made. The second day, he rode to the town proper, tying his horse outside a general store that had grand opening painted on its window. Inside, a middle-aged woman arranged goods on shelves while her husband worked on the counter. They looked up as he entered, smiles appearing automatically. "Welcome, welcome," the woman said. "You're new in town. Just arrived." "Few days ago," Elias said, looking around at the carefully organized inventory. Flour, sugar, tools, cloth, everything a frontier town would need. "You've put together a fine store." "Thank you." The pride in her voice was unmistakable. "My husband and I ran a store in Pennsylvania for 20 years. When we heard about Stonegate Station, about the opportunities, well, we sold everything and came west. It's a risk, but it's our risk, you know." "I know," Elias said quietly. He bought some supplies he didn't particularly need, paid with money that felt heavier than usual, and left without revealing who he was. He walked the streets for hours, introducing himself as Elias Stone, but letting people assume he was just another newcomer. No one connected him to the land dispute. Holloway had clearly kept that information contained. He visited the half-built school, spoke with a teacher who traveled from Boston to take the position. He watched construction crews working on a church. He stood in the rail yard and imagined trains arriving and departing, carrying goods and people, connecting this isolated valley to the wider world. Every conversation, every observation added weight to his decision. These people had staked their futures on a promise. The question was whether that promise had been built on honest ground or stolen land. By late afternoon, word must have reached Holloway that Elias was in town because the construction supervisor appeared on the street, walking toward him with determined purpose, but not aggression. "Mr. Stone," Holloway said, "will you come to my office? We should talk." "Tomorrow," Elias replied. "I told you 3 days. I meant it. I'm not trying to pressure you, I just—" Holloway looked around at his town, at the work he'd overseen. "I want you to understand what's at stake here, not for the railroad, but for these people. I've been watching, I understand." "Do you?" Holloway's voice carried frustration born of sleepless nights and impossible situations. "Do you understand that we've promised jobs to more than 300 workers, that we've sold plots of land to families who invested everything, that the territorial governor is planning to attend our opening ceremony in 6 weeks? I understand that Union Pacific made all those promises on land they didn't own," Elias said, his tone even but firm. "That's not my fault." "No, it's not." Holloway's shoulders sagged slightly. "It's mine. I was the one who recommended proceeding without securing full title. I thought—" He stopped himself. "It doesn't matter what I thought. You have every legal right to shut this down. I know that." "Then why are you asking me not to?" "Because it's the right thing to do." Holloway met his eyes directly. "Because these people don't deserve to pay for corporate arrogance. Because maybe there's a way forward that works for everyone." Elias considered the man before him, proud but not arrogant, willing to admit fault, genuinely concerned about the people whose lives he'd complicated. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "your office. Bring whoever has authority to make binding agreements. The regional director is arriving tonight from Omaha. He'll be there." "Good. So will I." As Elias walked away, he heard Holloway let out a long breath. Not relief exactly, but the sound of a man who'd at least bought himself another night before everything collapsed or came together. That evening, as Elias made camp on the ridge for what he decided would be the last time, a wagon arrived from Cedar Falls. Martha climbed down, carrying a basket and wearing the determined expression that had intimidated 3 generations of Stone men. "Thought you might need a proper meal," she said, unpacking bread and stew and pie still warm from her oven. and someone to talk sense into you before you make a mistake. Elias smiled despite the weight of his situation. What mistake would that be? Thinking you have to do this alone. She sat beside him, looking down at the town. Your father was brilliant, but he was lonely. He pushed away everyone who tried to help him think through his decisions. Don't make that same mistake. What would you do if you were me? Martha was quiet for a long time, watching the lamplight begin to appear in the valley below. I'd remember that your mother once told you the only wealth that matters is the wealth that helps others thrive. I'd think about what kind of future you want to build, not just what kind of revenge you could take. She turned to look at him. And I'd remember that your father gave you this gift not to see you become him, but to see you become better than him. They ate together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge above the mountains. Later, after Martha had returned to town with promises to be present for tomorrow's meeting, Elias sat alone with his father's letter and his mother's compass. Tomorrow, he would negotiate the future. But tonight, he finally understood what his father had been trying to teach him. Power wasn't about control or domination. It was about choice. About deciding what kind of world you wanted to build when the tools were placed in your hands. His father had been ruthless but strategic. His mother had been kind but principled. Elias would need to be both. Strategic enough to secure what was fair, kind enough to remember that fairness included the dreams of people who'd risked everything on a promise. The compass needle pointed north. True north. And for the first time since learning of his inheritance, Elias felt certain he knew which direction that was. The Union Pacific construction office was crowded with tension the next morning. James Holloway sat at his desk, looking like a man who hadn't slept. Beside him was an older gentleman in an expensive suit, the regional director from Omaha, whose name was introduced as William Thornton. 2 lawyers flanked him, carrying briefcases full of contracts and contingencies. Elias arrived exactly at 9, wearing the same simple clothes he'd worn throughout. He'd considered dressing up, trying to match their formality, but decided against it. Let them see him as he was, a working man who happened to hold all the leverage. Martha accompanied him, serving as his witness and counsel. Tobias Weaver would have come, but Elias had asked him to remain in Cedar Falls, handling another matter that would soon become relevant. Mr. Stone, Thornton began, standing to offer his hand. Thank you for meeting with us. I've come directly from Omaha to discuss a resolution that benefits everyone involved. Elias shook his hand, noted the firmness of the grip and the calculation in the man's eyes. This was someone who negotiated for a living, who knew how to turn disadvantages into advantages through sheer force of personality. Before we begin, Elias said, remaining standing, I want to make something clear. I'm not here to destroy what you've built, but I am here to ensure that what's been built on my land is built fairly. Of course, Thornton said smoothly, and Union Pacific is prepared to offer generous compensation for any inconvenience our premature construction may have caused. Inconvenience. Elias let the word hang in the air. That's an interesting way to describe building an entire town without permission. One of the lawyers spoke up. Mr. Stone, we should clarify that Union Pacific did attempt to acquire this property through proper channels. Your father refused all offers. Had he been willing to negotiate? My father was under no obligation to sell his property, Elias interrupted, just as I'm under no obligation now. Thornton raised a hand, silencing his lawyer. You're absolutely right. Let me be direct, Mr. Stone. We made assumptions we shouldn't have made. We proceeded with construction, believing we could force a favorable outcome. That was arrogant and frankly foolish. He gestured to a chair. Please sit. Let's discuss this as reasonable men. Elias sat, and Martha took a position by the door, her presence both reassuring and oddly intimidating. She'd raised these boys, and her judgment carried weight even in a room full of lawyers and executives. We are prepared to offer $350,000 for full ownership of the property, Thornton said, placing a contract on the desk. Plus guaranteed employment for you as a Union Pacific land agent, should you desire it. This is substantially more than the property's assessed value. Elias didn't touch the contract, and substantially less than it's worth to you. Value is subjective, Mr. Stone. No, it's not. Value is what someone will pay to avoid losing something irreplaceable. Elias leaned forward. You've invested more than $2 million. You've made promises to settlers, merchants, workers. You've committed to infrastructure that has no alternative location. The only way forward for your western expansion runs through property I control, so let's be honest about what that's worth. Thornton's smile tightened. You drive a hard bargain. I drive a fair one. I want $500,000, plus a 5% ownership stake in Stonegate Station's commercial operations in perpetuity. The lawyers looked shocked. Holloway winced. Thornton's face went carefully neutral. That's quite ambitious. That's less than a quarter of what you've already spent, with built-in incentive for me to ensure the town's success. Elias pulled out the deed, placed it on the desk. More importantly, it acknowledges what this land is actually worth, not what you want to pay for it. And if we refuse, then I exercise my legal right to demand removal of all structures built without authorization. Union Pacific loses its investment, the town closes, and hundreds of people suffer. Elias met Thornton's eyes steadily. But I don't want that. What I want is to be treated as a partner, not an obstacle. Thornton studied him for a long moment. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone easier to bully or buy? The admission was surprisingly honest. Your father was a hard man. His sons have reputations as ambitious and greedy. But you, he paused, you're asking for something reasonable disguised as something outrageous. Is it outrageous to expect fair value for my property? No, Thornton admitted. It's not. He stood, walked to the window overlooking the town. Let me make a counteroffer. $400,000 and a 3% stake. $450,000 and 4%. Thornton turned back, a genuine smile appearing. You do this for a living. No, but I learned from a man who understood leverage. Your father? My father. Elias stood as well. Do we have an agreement? Thornton looked at his lawyers, who nodded reluctantly. We do, subject to approval from the board, but I can make that happen. He extended his hand. You're going to do well, Mr. Stone. Welcome to the railroad business. As they shook hands, Holloway looked relieved enough to collapse. Martha smiled from her position by the door, and Elias felt something settle in his chest. Not victory exactly, but the satisfaction of having negotiated fairly for all parties. The lawyers began preparing documents immediately. The process would take weeks to finalize, but the terms were set. Elias had turned $1 silver into a fortune and secured his future in a single morning. But as he left the office with Martha, he knew the harder negotiation still waited. Because news of this agreement would reach his brothers, and they would understand what it meant. Their youngest brother, whom they'd mocked and dismissed, now controlled wealth that eclipsed their inheritance. You did well, Martha said as they walked toward where their horses were tied. I did what Father wanted me to do. Proved I could be strategic without being cruel. And now I visit the ranch, before Marcus and Samuel come looking for me. Martha's expression grew concerned. They won't be happy, Elias. They've been counting your father's fortune as theirs for years. I know, but there's something they don't know yet. Something I need to tell them before they hear it elsewhere. He rode out of Stonegate Station as the legitimate partner in its success, carrying papers that would make him wealthy beyond his previous imaginings. But his thoughts weren't on wealth. They were on family, on the second deed still hidden in Tobias Weaver's office, on the coming confrontation that would determine whether the Stone brothers could be brothers at all. The ride to the ranch took most of the day. As Elias approached the main house, the house he'd left 10 years ago, swearing never to return, he felt the weight of history pressing down. Every fence post, every building, every acre of grazing land held memories, some good, most complicated. Marcus and Samuel were in the yard, supervising the loading of cattle for shipment. They looked up as Elias rode in, their expressions shifting from surprise to suspicion to something harder to define. "Well," Marcus said, walking forward, "the prodigal returns. Come to beg for a job after all." "No," Elias said, dismounting. "I came to talk about Father's estate, about what he really left us." Samuel joined his brother, both of them forming a wall of resentment and barely contained anger. "We know what he left you," Samuel said. $1 and worthless dirt. The whole territory is laughing about it. They won't be laughing much longer. Elias reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a copy of the railroad agreement. "Father's worthless dirt just made me a partner in the territory's largest railroad hub. I negotiated a deal worth $500,000 this morning." The words hit his brothers like physical blows. Marcus snatched the document, read it with growing disbelief. Samuel looked over his shoulder, his face draining of color. This can't be real," Marcus stammered. "It's real. Signed this morning. Witnessed by Union Pacific's regional director." Elias watched their faces as comprehension dawned. "Father didn't leave me an insult. He left me an opportunity, one I've taken advantage of." Marcus crushed the paper in his fist, rage overtaking shock. "You conniving. You knew all along." "I knew nothing until I rode out to see the property. Just like Father planned." Elias kept his voice calm, refusing to be drawn into anger. "He tested me. I passed." "So what are you here for?" Samuel demanded. "To rub our faces in it, to show us how clever you are." "No," Elias said quietly. "I'm here because we need to talk about the ranch, about water rights, about what Father really left all three of us." Something in his tone made both brothers pause. Marcus released the crumpled document, his expression shifting from rage to uncertainty. "What do you mean?" Elias pulled out the second deed, the one Tobias had verified, the one that would change everything. "I mean that Father's games weren't just about me. They were about all of us. And if we can't figure out how to be brothers, we're all going to lose everything he built." He handed Marcus the deed, watched as his brother read it, watched as understanding dawned like sunrise over a battlefield. The war between the Stone brothers was about to begin, or end, depending on whether they could learn the lesson their father had spent 15 years trying to teach them. That family was either everything or nothing, and which it would be was entirely up to them. Marcus held the deed in hands that trembled with something beyond anger. His eyes moved across the legal text once, twice, 3 times, as if repetition might change what it said. Samuel leaned in to read over his shoulder, his face going from confusion to comprehension to something approaching panic. "Crystal Creek," Marcus read aloud, his voice hollow. "All water rights in perpetuity." "That's the headwaters," Samuel said, his words coming faster. That feeds everything. The southern pastures, the stock ponds, He looked up at Elias, realization hitting like cold water. "Without that creek, the ranch is worthless." "Not worthless," Elias corrected quietly. "You still have thousands of acres, all the buildings, the herds, but in Wyoming summer, without reliable water." "We have nothing," Marcus finished, his voice flat. He looked at the deed again, checking the date. 20 years. He bought this 20 years ago. "Before any of us were old enough to understand what it meant," Elias said. "Before he divided the ranch between you. Before he even got sick." Marcus's hands clenched, crumpling the deed. This was planned, all of it. He spent decades setting up this trap. "Not a trap," Elias said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. test. A test. Samuel's voice rose, anger breaking through shock. He leaves us a ranch we can't run and calls it a test. What kind of father does that? The kind who wanted to know if his sons could work together. Elias took a breath, steadying himself. Or if they'd tear each other apart the moment he was gone. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. And which are we doing right now, little brother? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with accusation and history. Around them, ranch hands had stopped working, sensing the tension but staying well clear. These were men who'd learned to recognize when the Stone brothers were at each other's throats. That depends on you, Elias said. I didn't come here to destroy you. I came here because Father left me something I didn't ask for, power over your futures, and I need to decide what to do with it. What to do with it? Marcus's rage was building, his face flushing red. You think you have a choice? You think you can just... He stopped himself, visibly struggling for control. When he spoke again, his voice was dangerous with forced calm. What do you want, Elias? Name your price. There's no price. Bullshit. Everyone has a price. Not for this. Elias looked between his brothers, seeing them clearly perhaps for the first time. Not as the giants of his childhood, but as men trapped by their father's expectations just as much as he'd been. I don't want your money. I want something harder. What? Samuel asked, suspicious. I want us to be brothers. Real brothers, not just three men sharing a name. Marcus barked a laugh. You can't be serious. I am. Father left us pieces of an empire, but he made sure none of us could hold it alone. The ranch needs water I control. Stonegate Station needs access through land I own. My fortune is tied to both of you, whether I like it or not. So you're saying we're stuck with each other? Samuel said bitterly. I'm saying we have a choice. We can fight over what Father left, spend years in courts and conflicts, watching everything he built crumble. Or, Elias pulled out his father's letter, the one Tobias had given him. Or we can try to understand what he actually wanted. I don't give a damn what he wanted, Marcus spat. He's dead. He doesn't get to control us from the grave. Doesn't he? Elias held up the letter. He's been controlling all of us our entire lives, pushing us in directions we didn't understand for reasons we couldn't see. This is his last move, his final manipulation. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't malicious. Samuel reached for the letter, but Marcus grabbed his arm, stopping him. No. Whatever's in there, it's just more lies, more justifications for his cruelty. You don't know that. Don't I? Marcus turned on Elias, years of resentment pouring out. You left, Elias. You walked away and got to be free. Do you know what it was like staying? Having him judge every decision, question every choice, never being good enough? We inherited this ranch, but we've been paying for it our entire lives. The raw honesty in Marcus's voice stopped Elias cold. He'd spent 10 years imagining his brothers as privileged, as favored as having everything he'd been denied. He'd never considered what it cost them to receive that favor. I'm sorry, Elias said, and meant it. I didn't know. Of course you didn't. You were too busy feeling sorry for yourself. Maybe we all were, Samuel said quietly. Both brothers turned to look at him. Maybe Father wanted us all to feel like failures so we'd have to succeed together. That's insane, Marcus said, but with less conviction. Is it? Look at what he did. Samuel took the letter from Elias, opened it, began to read. His eyes moved quickly, drinking in their father's words. When he finished, he handed it to Marcus without comment. Marcus read slowly, his expression shifting through anger to confusion to something that might have been pain. When he reached the end, he stood very still for a long moment. He says... Marcus's voice cracked. He cleared his throat. Tried again. He says we lack the ability to question, to think beyond profit to principle. He wasn't entirely wrong, Samuel admitted. We were what he made us. Marcus's anger flared again, but it was different now. Not rage, but hurt. He taught us to value wealth above everything, and now he judges us for learning the lesson? I think he regretted it, Elias said softly. I think he looked at what he'd created and realized he'd built men who would inherit his fortune, but not his vision. And you're different, Marcus challenged. You're the chosen one who gets to fix his mistakes. No, I'm the one who walked away because I couldn't stomach what he was, which apparently made me trustworthy in his eyes. Elias moved closer to his brothers. But I can't do this alone. I don't want to do it alone. Do what, exactly? Samuel asked. Build something better. Use what Father left to create a legacy that's about more than just money. Stonegate Station is going to be a major town. The ranch feeds hundreds of families. We have the chance to shape this entire region. Elias paused. Or we can destroy each other fighting over the pieces. Marcus looked at the ranch house, at the land stretching to the horizon, at the life his father had built and then weaponized against his own sons. What are you proposing? Partnership. Real partnership. We divide the ranch into 3 equal sections. Each of us manages our own portion, but the water rights are shared equally, as long as all 3 of us cooperate. And if we don't? Samuel asked. Then whoever breaks the partnership loses access to water for their section. Their land becomes as worthless as everyone thought mine was. Mutual assured destruction, Marcus said, understanding the structure. Father's final joke, or his final gift, depends on how we choose to see it. Elias looked between his brothers. I'm not asking you to like me. I'm not even asking you to forgive the past. I'm asking if you're willing to try being brothers for the sake of everything Father built. The silence stretched between them, filled with decades of resentment and pain and competitive cruelty. 3 boys raised to fight for their father's approval, now facing the reality that the only way forward was together. Samuel spoke first. I'm tired, Marcus. Tired of always being in the middle, always trying to keep peace between you two. Tired of feeling like I'm only worth what I inherit. He looked at Elias. If this partnership gives us a chance to build something ourselves, something we actually earned, I'm willing to try. All eyes turned to Marcus, the eldest brother, the one who'd carried the weight of expectation longest, the one with the most to lose by accepting this arrangement. Marcus walked to the porch of the main house and sat heavily on the steps, his father's letter still in his hands. He really thought I'd sell out, that I'd take this land and cash it in for whatever I could get. He thought we all would, Elias said, sitting beside him. That's why he set it up this way. Was he right? About me? It was the most vulnerable question Elias had ever heard his brother ask. I don't know, but you don't have to be what he expected. You can be what you choose. Marcus was quiet for a long time, watching the sun lower toward the mountains. Finally, he said, I want my father's signet ring, the one with the family crest. It's yours, Elias said, confused by the request. No, I want it melted down, reformed into 3 new rings, something that marks us as partners, not rivals. Marcus looked at his brothers. If we're going to do this, we do it completely. New family, new legacy. Samuel smiled. I'd wear that ring. So would I. Elias agreed. Marcus stood, extended his hand first to Samuel, then to Elias. The handshakes were awkward, weighted with years of hurt, but they were real. Partnership, then. 3 equal parts, shared water rights. No one succeeds unless all 3 succeed. Agreed, Samuel said. Agreed, Elias echoed. Around them, the ranch hands cautiously returned to work, sensing that whatever storm had been brewing had passed. The sun continued its descent, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. And 3 brothers who'd inherited an empire discovered that sometimes the greatest fortune isn't what you're given, but what you build together from the pieces. Martha emerged from the house, where she'd been watching from a window, and brought them coffee. She didn't say anything, but the smile on her weathered face said she'd been hoping for this outcome since the moment Elias Stone had sealed that letter 15 years ago. Some tests, it turned out, were designed not to prove failure, but to create the possibility of redemption. And the Stone brothers had just passed the most important test of their lives. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of legal documents, survey work, and awkward conversations that slowly became less awkward. The Stone brothers divided their father's empire with the help of Tobias Weaver and a surveyor old Ben recommended, a young man named Thomas who'd worked with Elias in the Colorado camps and could be trusted to measure fairly. Martha insisted they take their meals together at the main house during this time. "You're going to be partners," she said firmly. "You need to learn to sit at the same table without wanting to kill each other." The first few dinners were exercises in painful silence, broken only by Martha's commentary and the clink of silverware. But gradually, conversation began. Not about the past, that territory was still too raw to navigate safely. Instead, they talked about the land, about cattle management, about the opportunities and challenges ahead. Marcus proved to have an encyclopedic knowledge of breeding lines and bloodstock quality. He'd spent 20 years turning the Stone Ranch herds into some of the finest in Wyoming, and his pride in that work was justified. Samuel had quietly become an expert in grazing management and land conservation, finding ways to prevent overuse while maximizing productivity. And Elias brought his surveying experience and his new railroad connections, seeing possibilities for how the ranch could integrate with the expanding commercial networks. Together, they were formidable. Separately, they had been fragments of their father's vision. "The north section should be yours, Marcus," Elias said one evening over maps spread across the dining table. "You've already got the infrastructure for breeding operations there. The barns, the corrals, the hands who know the work." "The southern section for Samuel," Marcus agreed, tracing boundaries. "Those are your best grazing lands, and you know every waterhole and shelter point." "Which leaves me the western section," Elias said, studying the terrain. "It's the roughest land, but it's closest to Stonegate Station. I can develop it for shorter rotations, maybe work with the railroad to establish regular shipping." "The water from Crystal Creek needs to be split 3 ways," Samuel noted, marking flow patterns. "We'll need to build new channels and gates, probably take a month of work." "Split the cost 3 ways," Marcus suggested. "And the labor. Each of us provides crews." It was the first time they'd agreed on something without argument, and the moment hung in the air like a minor miracle. Martha, listening from the kitchen doorway, allowed herself a small smile. But the most difficult discussion came when they addressed how to manage conflicts. Because conflicts would come. That was inevitable. "We need rules," Samuel said. "Clear procedures for when we disagree." "Father would have just made the decision himself," Marcus said, then caught himself. "But we're not father." "Thank God for that," Elias muttered, and to everyone's surprise, Marcus laughed. They established a simple system, majority vote on matters affecting all 3 sections, but each brother had autonomy over his own land within the partnership framework. Disputes that couldn't be resolved would go to binding arbitration. They'd already identified a territorial judge who'd agreed to serve in that role. "And the water rights," Samuel pressed. "What happens if one of us violates the partnership agreement?" The question hung heavy. This was the enforcement mechanism, the sword hanging over all their heads. Elias pulled out the deed, read the precise language his father had drafted 15 years ago. "It says, shared access contingent upon mutual cooperation," he read. "Any breach of cooperation results in cessation of water rights for the breaching party." "So if I cheat you," Marcus said slowly, "I lose my water and my land becomes worthless." "Exactly." Father really did think of everything. He had 15 years to plan it, Elias pointed out. Most men don't get that kind of time to craft their legacy. Samuel leaned back in his chair, studying his brothers. Are we really going to do this? Trust each other with everything? I don't know, Marcus admitted. But I know I'm tired of fighting. Tired of always having to be the strongest, the smartest, the one who inherits the throne. He looked at Elias. You were right about what you said. Father made us compete for scraps of his approval. We don't have to keep playing that game. We could build something new, Elias said. Something that's actually ours. I want that, Samuel said quietly. I want to know what it feels like to succeed because of what I did, not just because of what I inherited. They signed the partnership agreement 3 weeks after Jebediah's death in Tobias Weaver's office, with Martha and old Ben serving as witnesses. The document was 20 pages long, covering every contingency they could imagine. At the bottom, 3 signatures: Marcus Stone, Samuel Stone, Elias Stone. Brothers and partners. Your father would be proud, Tobias said as he notarized the final page. Or surprised. Possibly both. He'd probably find a way to criticize it, Marcus said, but without the bitterness that would have colored those words a month ago. The signet ring arrived from the blacksmith the following week. Marcus had commissioned a local craftsman who'd studied metalwork in Philadelphia. The man had melted down their father's heavy gold ring, the one that had marked Jebediah Stone as the patriarch of a Western empire, and reformed the metal into 3 simple silver bands. Each ring was identical, engraved with the same message. Stone Brothers, 1882. They held the ceremony at their father's grave on a morning when spring was giving way to summer. The 3 brothers stood before the simple headstone, each holding a ring. I don't know if you can hear this, Marcus said, addressing the grave. I don't know if you're proud or disappointed or laughing at us. But we're going to try to do what you wanted. We're going to try to be brothers. Samuel added, You were a hard man to love, Father. But maybe that's because you didn't know how to show love except through tests and challenges. We're going to try to be better than that. Elias spoke last, pulling the silver dollar from his pocket and placing it on the gravestone. Thank you for believing I was strong enough for this, for seeing something in me I didn't see in myself. I'll try to honor that faith. They placed the rings on their fingers together, a synchronized gesture that felt both silly and profound. The metal was cool and unfamiliar, but already beginning to warm with body heat. Martha watched from a distance, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Old Ben stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder. He'd have liked to see this, Ben said quietly. He did see it, Martha replied. In his mind, 15 years ago, that's why he planned it this way. Back at the ranch, work continued on dividing the property and building the new water management system. The 3 brothers worked alongside their crews, Marcus stripped to his shirt sleeves alongside Elias and Samuel. The physical labor created a different kind of communication, less about words, more about shared purpose. But challenges emerged quickly. Marcus's breeding program required more water than originally calculated. Samuel discovered that drought had affected his southern range more severely than expected. Elias's plans for integrated railroad shipping hit snags when Union Pacific delayed construction of a spur line. Each problem became an opportunity to practice their new partnership. When Marcus needed more water, Samuel and Elias agreed to temporary adjustments. When Samuel faced drought complications, Marcus loaned him access to northern pastures for rotation. When Elias's shipping plans stalled, his brothers helped him develop alternative strategies. They fought, certainly. Old habits and older resentments didn't disappear overnight. But now, when they fought as partners, trying to solve problems together, not as rivals trying to destroy each other. One evening, as they reviewed quarterly accounts together, a practice they'd agreed to maintain for transparency, Samuel made an observation. We're more profitable than father ever was. All 3 sections combined. Marcus checked the numbers, nodded in confirmation. Cooperation is apparently good business. Father knew that, Elias said. That's why he forced us into it. I'm starting to think he wasn't as cruel as we believed, Samuel admitted. Just calculated. He was both, Marcus said firmly. But maybe his cruelty served a purpose we're only now understanding. News of the Stone brothers' partnership spread through the territory. Other ranchers watched with skepticism, waiting for it to fail. But months passed, then a full year, and the partnership not only survived, but thrived. The Stone Ranch expanded its operations, improved its stock, and became a model for cooperative land management. In Stonegate Station, Elias's 4% stake in commercial operations began generating significant returns. The town grew faster than anyone expected, drawing settlers and businesses from across the country. His involvement ensured fair treatment for workers and reasonable policies for merchants. The kind of oversight that made communities sustainable rather than exploitative. The brothers established a tradition of monthly meetings at the main house, reviewing operations and planning for the future. Martha insisted on cooking dinner for these occasions, saying she'd spent too many years watching them eat separately to miss the chance to feed them together now. During one such meeting, as they discussed plans for a joint cattle sale that would showcase all 3 sections' stock, Marcus raised his glass of whiskey in an unexpected toast. To father, he said, for being smart enough to know we needed each other, even when we didn't know it ourselves. To father, Samuel echoed, for the hardest gift anyone ever gave us. To father, Elias finished, for teaching us that sometimes the things that look like curses are actually blessings we're too blind to see. They drank, and in that moment, 3 men who'd spent their lives competing finally understood what their father had been trying to give them all along. Not wealth, though that came. Not power, though they had that too. But something far more valuable and infinitely more rare. A family, tested and refined and made stronger by the very trials that should have broken them. Outside, the Wyoming wind swept across the ranch, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. The mountains stood eternal and unchanging, keeping their secrets, and somewhere, perhaps, Elias Stone rested easier, knowing that his gamble had paid off in ways even his calculating mind might not have fully anticipated. His sons had inherited his empire, but more importantly, they'd inherited each other, and that, in the end, was the fortune that mattered most. The crisis came in the 2nd year of their partnership, during the harshest winter Wyoming had seen in a generation. Snow fell in October and didn't stop until March. Temperatures plunged to depths that killed cattle and broke the spirits of even experienced ranchers. The Stone Ranch, divided into 3 sections with 3 different management styles, faced the storm from 3 different angles. Marcus's breeding stock, valuable but vulnerable, needed constant shelter and supplemental feed. Samuel's range cattle, hardier but more exposed, required moving to protected valleys and careful monitoring. Elias's western section, still being developed, had the fewest animals but the roughest terrain. The water system they'd built together froze solid in December. The channels that distributed Crystal Creek's flow to all 3 sections became useless lines of ice. Each brother faced the same terrible calculation: limited water sources, animals dying of thirst despite snow all around them, and the knowledge that any attempt to redirect water to his own section would violate their partnership agreement. Marcus was the first to call an emergency meeting. He rode through a blizzard to reach the main house, where Martha had kept fires burning and coffee hot despite the depleted wood supply. Samuel arrived an hour later, his face red from windburn. Elias came last, having traveled the farthest through the worst conditions. "We're losing 10 head a day," Marcus said without preamble, wrapping his hands around a coffee mug. The breeding stock can't survive on snow alone. They need clean water, or I'm going to watch my entire program die. I'm losing animals too, Samuel said, but it's exposure more than water. I need to move 200 head to the northern valleys for shelter. My valleys, Marcus pointed out. Our valleys, Elias corrected. Remember the partnership agreement. In emergencies, we pool resources. Easy for you to say, Marcus shot back. Your losses are minimal. You barely have any stock established yet. The accusation hung in the air, familiar and dangerous. This was the old pattern, competition disguised as conversation, each brother calculating his advantage rather than their collective survival. You're right, Elias said quietly. My section is barely developed, which means I have something you need. Flexibility. I can ride out this winter with minimal losses. But you can't. Neither of you. Samuel looked between his brothers. So, what are you proposing? I'm proposing we honor what Father wanted. We work together, or we fail separately. Elias pulled out maps, spread them on the table. Marcus, you need water for breeding stock. Samuel, you need shelter for range cattle. I have neither problem because I planned smaller. Are you gloating? Marcus demanded. No, I'm offering a solution. Elias traced routes on the map. My section has 3 natural springs that haven't frozen completely. They're small, but they're running. Move your breeding stock to my western pastures. It's rough country, but there's water and enough shelter to get through. Marcus stared at the map, then at his brother. You'd let my cattle onto your land? They're not my cattle and your land. They're ours. That's what partnership means. And what about my range cattle? Samuel asked. Marcus's northern valleys, Elias said. He opens them for your herds. We consolidate. We survive together. This violates every principle of individual management, Marcus protested. We agreed each section would be autonomous. We also agreed to mutual cooperation, Elias countered. And Father's deed says that cooperation is required. Not requested, required. So you're using the water rights to force us? No, I'm using common sense to save us. Elias stood, looked his brother in the eye. Marcus, you can be right, or you can save your breeding program. You choose. The moment stretched, tense with the weight of pride and pragmatism warring in Marcus's expression. Finally, he nodded. All right, we move the animals. But I want it recorded that we're establishing precedent. In emergencies, section boundaries dissolve. Agreed, Samuel said. We succeed together, or we fail together. That was always the deal. They spent the next 2 days organizing the movement of cattle across section boundaries. Ranch hands who'd been trained to think in terms of Marcus's crew or Samuel's operation found themselves working as a single unit. The physical reality of partnership became impossible to ignore. Martha watched from the main house as 3 sets of crews worked in coordination, moving animals through blinding snow toward shelter and water. They're really doing it, she said to old Ben, who'd come to help with the logistics. They're really doing it, Ben agreed. Your boss knew what he was doing when he set this up. He was a hard man, Martha said, but he knew his sons better than they knew themselves. By the time the animals were moved and settled, all 3 brothers were exhausted. They gathered in the main house, stripped down to shirt sleeves despite the cold, drinking coffee and tallying losses that were significant but survivable. We saved them, Samuel said, almost surprised. The crisis that should have broken us, we survived it. Because we didn't try to survive it alone, Marcus acknowledged. His eyes met Elias's. You could have let me fail, let my breeding program collapse, bought my section for pennies when I couldn't pay my debts. I could have, Elias agreed. Is that what you would have done if our positions were reversed? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. A year ago, yes, I would have watched you fail and called it justice. He looked down at the silver ring on his finger. But Father spent 15 years teaching us a different way. Took me too long to learn it, took all of us too long, Samuel said. Outside, the storm continued its assault on Wyoming. But inside the main house, three brothers had passed the ultimate test of their partnership, the test of choosing collective survival over individual advantage. And in doing so, they'd become something their father never quite managed to be, a family that valued each other more than victory. Spring arrived like a promise kept, melting the snow and revealing a landscape transformed by survival. The Stone Ranch had weathered the worst winter in memory, and while their losses were real, they were far less than neighboring operations that had tried to face the storm alone. The brothers gathered at the main house on a morning when the first green shoots pushed through thawing ground. They'd called the meeting to settle accounts, to calculate exactly what the winter had cost each section and how to balance those costs fairly. My breeding program lost 37 head, Marcus reported, his voice steady but carrying the weight of each animal. But that's out of 300, 12% losses. Other breeders in the territory are reporting 40, 50%. Range cattle losses were 53, Samuel added, but we would have lost twice that without access to Marcus's northern valleys. Maybe more. My section took minimal losses, Elias said. 15 head, mostly from exposure before we could consolidate. But my infrastructure took damage. Fences down. One barn roof collapsed. They looked at the numbers together, adding and subtracting, trying to determine how to split the costs. It was Marcus who finally pushed the ledger aside. "This is wrong," he said. "We're still thinking like separate operations trying to settle debts, but that's not what we are anymore." Samuel looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean the partnership absorbed these losses together. My animals survived because of Elias's water and Samuel's labor. Samuel's herd survived because of my land and Elias's planning. We can't separate out who owes what when we all contributed to saving each other." "So what do you propose?" Elias asked. "We write it off as a partnership loss, split the replacement costs 3 ways, and we formalize what happened this winter as standard practice. In emergencies, all boundaries dissolve. We function as a single operation with 3 managers instead of 3 operations that sometimes cooperate." It was a radical suggestion, one that went beyond what their father had mandated. The partnership agreement required cooperation, but what Marcus proposed was integration, a deeper commitment that required greater trust. "I'm in," Samuel said without hesitation. "This winter proved we're stronger together. Why limit that to emergencies?" Elias studied his brothers, seeing something in their faces that had been absent 2 years ago. Genuine respect for each other, born not from blood, but from shared adversity and shared triumph. "We'd need to restructure the accounting," he said. "Combine the ledgers, share profits proportionally based on contribution rather than section." "More complexity?" Marcus agreed. "More trust required. But more honest," Samuel pointed out. "More aligned with what we're actually doing." They spent the morning redesigning their partnership structure, building on the foundation their father had created, but making it truly their own. Where Jebediah had mandated cooperation through leverage, his sons chose integration through conviction. Old Ben stopped by in the afternoon, found them still working through details at the dining table. "Heard you boys survived the winter better than anyone expected." "We survived it together," Marcus said. And there was pride in his voice, not the competitive pride of victory over others, but the quieter pride of accomplishment earned through collaboration. "Your father would be pleased," Ben said. "Maybe," Elias replied. "Or maybe he'd tell us we should have planned better, lost fewer animals, moved faster." "Probably," Ben laughed. "But he'd still be pleased. Seeing you 3 work as a unit, that was always his goal." After Ben left, Samuel voiced something that had been nagging at all of them. "Do you think he knew? When he set this up, did he know we'd actually make it work?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "I think he hoped, but hope and knowledge are different things." "He gave us the tools," Elias said. What we built with them was up to us. They signed the restructured partnership agreement that evening, as the sun painted the mountains in shades of gold. The new document was longer, more complex, reflecting the integration they'd chosen. But at its heart was a simple principle. The Stone brothers succeeded or failed as one. Martha served dinner that night, a celebration meal she had been planning since the snow began to melt. Pot roast with vegetables from her winter stores, fresh bread, and pie made with preserves she'd been saving for a special occasion. To survival, Marcus toasted, raising his glass. To partnership, Samuel added. To family, Elias finished. The kind we choose to be, not just the kind we're born into. They drank, and the evening settled into comfortable conversation. They talked about spring plans, calving season, planting, repairs needed after the harsh winter. But underlying all of it was a new confidence, a sense that they'd passed through fire and emerged not just intact, but stronger. Outside, the ranch spread beneath gathering stars. Cattle grazed in pastures that didn't belong to Marcus or Samuel or Elias, but to all three equally. Water flowed through channels that served not individual ambition, but collective prosperity. And in the mountains beyond, Stonegate Station grew and thrived under Elias's watchful management, connected now to the ranch not just through ownership, but through genuine care for community. The Stone Empire hadn't just survived its founder's death. It had been reborn through his son's willingness to become something better than he'd been, not just powerful or wealthy, but truly united. And that transformation, hard-won and honestly earned, was the greatest fortune Jebediah Stone had ever created. 5 years after Jebediah Stone's death, the territory he'd helped shape held a celebration that brought people from 300 miles in every direction. Stonegate Station was officially incorporating as a town, and the ceremony would mark its transformation from railroad hub to permanent community. Elias stood on a platform built for the occasion, looking out at a crowd of more than 2,000 people. The town behind him had grown beyond anyone's early expectations. Schools and churches, shops and homes, a newspaper office and a bank. Real civilization, built on land his father had quietly acquired with a vision few could have imagined. 5 years ago, Elias said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, this valley was called Deadman's Flats. People said nothing could grow here but rocks and regret. Today, it's home to families from 20 different states and 4 different countries. You've built something remarkable here, and I'm honored to have played a small part in that building. The crowd applauded. Among them were the families he'd met in those early days. The general store owners from Pennsylvania, the teacher from Boston, the merchants and craftsmen and laborers who'd staked their futures on a promise. They'd kept that promise to each other, building a community that was more than just profitable. It was decent. Marcus and Samuel sat in the front row, wearing their silver rings and the formal clothes that marked them as successful ranchers. Their sections of the Stone Ranch had become models of modern cattle management, written about in agricultural journals and studied by ranchers from across the West. But more than that, they'd become known as brothers who'd chosen cooperation over competition, setting an example that was quietly reshaping how family businesses operated throughout the territory. After the speeches and the ribbon cutting and the celebration dinner that Martha had helped organize, the 3 brothers found themselves alone on the ridge where Elias had first seen the valley's secret. The sun was setting, painting everything in those same golds and ambers that had witnessed so many turning points in their story. Do you ever think about that first day? Samuel asked, standing at the edge and looking down at the town. When you rode up here and saw all this? All the time, Elias admitted. I think about standing here with a silver dollar in my pocket, feeling like the biggest fool in Wyoming. You weren't a fool, Marcus said. You were the only one smart enough to see what Father was really giving you. Us, Elias corrected. What he was giving all of us. They were quiet for a moment, watching lamplights begin to appear in the valley below. 5 years of partnership had taught them the value of comfortable silence, of not needing to fill every moment with words. I went to his grave this morning, Marcus said, before the ceremony. Told him we'd made it work. What do you think he'd say? Samuel asked. If he could see all this. Marcus smiled slightly. Probably that we could have done it faster, more efficiently, made more profit. Sounds about right, Elias laughed. But then maybe... Marcus paused, choosing words carefully. Maybe he'd admit that we built something better than he imagined. Not just bigger or wealthier, but actually better. It was the highest praise Marcus had ever given their father, and also the most honest criticism. Elias Stone had been a master builder, but what his sons had built together surpassed his singular vision. The rings were a good idea, Samuel said, holding up his hand to catch the dying light. The simple silver band had developed a patina over 5 years of wear, marked by work and weather and time. Feels right, wearing something made from the old and transformed into something new. That's what we are, isn't it? Elias mused. Transformed from what he made us into what we chose to become. They descended from the ridge as darkness settled, riding back toward the ranch house where Martha had kept supper warm. The journey that had once felt like crossing battle lines now felt like coming home. They talked easily about plans for the coming year, new breeding experiments Marcus wanted to try, water conservation methods Samuel had been researching, expansion opportunities in Stonegate Station that Elias was negotiating. At the ranch, lights glowed in the main house. Martha met them at the door, older now but still sharp-eyed and formidable. About time, she said. Food's been ready for an hour. We were paying our respects, Marcus explained. To who? To Father. To the man who was smart enough to force us to become brothers. Martha's expression softened. He'd be proud of you boys, all 3 of you. She paused. He'd never say it, mind you, but he'd be proud. They ate together in the dining room where so many partnership discussions had taken place, where arguments had been settled and plans had been made, and slowly, painfully, a family had been rebuilt from its broken pieces. After dinner, Elias walked to the study, the room that had been his father's domain for 3 decades. The old leather journal sat on the desk where he'd left it that morning, open to one of the last entries Jebediah had made before his death. The boy doesn't know his own strength, the entry read. He thinks I've pushed him away, but I've been pushing him toward something greater than he can see. If my calculations are correct, he'll be angry when he learns the truth. But anger can be refined into purpose. And purpose, properly directed, can change everything. Elias touched the page gently, feeling the indentations his father's pen had made. You were right, he said to the empty room. About most of it anyway. We were angry, but we found purpose, and we changed everything. He closed the journal and returned it to the shelf, then pulled out his father's final letter, the one he'd read and reread until he'd memorized every word. He didn't need to open it anymore to remember what it said. The message had become part of him, woven into how he understood family and legacy, and the strange, complicated ways that love manifests across generations. Outside, Wyoming night settled over the ranch. Stars emerged in their millions, vast and eternal. The mountains stood guard as they had for eons, keeping secrets and witnessing transformations, And somewhere in that vastness, perhaps, a stern old man rested easier, knowing that his greatest gamble had paid off beyond even his calculating mind's expectations. His sons hadn't just inherited his empire. They'd inherited the wisdom to transform it into something worth more than money could measure. Marcus found Elias standing by the window, looking out at the land they now managed together. Coming to bed. In a minute, just thinking. About father. About us. About how we almost destroyed what he built trying to honor him the wrong way. Marcus put a hand on his brother's shoulder, a gesture that would have been impossible 5 years ago. We found the right way eventually. That's what matters. Is it enough? Everything we've built. Look at what we've created, Marcus said, gesturing toward the window. A ranch that employs 100 families, a town that gives thousands of people opportunity, a partnership that proves family doesn't have to be about competition. Is it enough? He smiled. I think it's more than enough. I think it's everything Father hoped for and couldn't quite achieve himself. Elias nodded, feeling something settle in his chest. Not victory, not vindication, but peace. The journey from humiliated youngest son to respected partner and community leader had been longer and harder than any trail he'd ridden. But standing here now, wearing a ring made from his father's legacy, transformed, looking out at an empire built on cooperation rather than conquest, he understood something fundamental. Sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones everyone overlooks, including the family standing right beside you, ready to build something better than any of you could build alone. That lesson, learned painfully and honestly over 5 years of choosing each other again and again, was worth more than all the land and water and railroad towns combined. It was, quite simply, the fortune that mattered most.